Okay, let's move into the final composition technique for this today's live stream, and that is diminishing perspectives. And so, with diminishing perspectives, what this really allows you to do is to add depth to your images. It allows you to kind of give an extra dimension to your images and draw your viewer into your photographs, to give them more to look at, to draw them in, to try to tell the story in a deeper way, both literally and metaphorically. Let's have a look at a couple of examples. I'll just bring this image up a bit larger. So here in this image, you can see that I was in an elevated position on a bridge. So you could take this shot with a drone, for example, and fly a drone up and take a shot from this elevated position. But for this particular image, I was on a bridge looking out over a river, looking down this semi-polluted waterway. And what I was trying to do with this particular image was show the contrast between the polluted river in the foreground and the nice, modern, clean buildings in the background. And so again, that's part of the story of Jakarta, is this contrast between these two types of areas that exist within the city. So, excuse me, within this one particular image, I was trying to use the diminishing perspective of the river to draw you from the foreground, where I captured this little boat going across the river. But the leading lines would draw you down further, deeper into the photograph, into the background, down towards those buildings in the background. So again, I'm using the diminishing perspective, this to connect the foreground to the background, because I'm trying to connect you with one part of the story about the polluted river and the rundown areas, and connect it to the other part of the story about Jakarta, which is these richer, more affluent areas, both living side by side. So again, it's using a composition technique to tell a story. And you can see that, quite clearly when I bring up the lines, just to give you an indication of where your lines are leading you from the foreground to the background. And similar in this image that we just looked at just before, of the man looking out over onto the polluted waterway, in that, again, rivers are a great way to do this. If you get a slightly elevated position, you can use those natural lines of the river going away from you into the distance as a diminishing perspective. And here, like I mentioned before, with this particular image, with the center focus catching your attention on the man in the middle, but his gaze takes you down deeper into the photograph, following that diminishing perspective as it leads you deeper into the photograph. So again, you're starting your journey looking at the photograph with the foreground, and it's taking you into the background, taking you into the image, taking you into the story. And with this image, it's almost like a river. This is a flooded area of the port in northern Jakarta, where from this slightly elevated position, this is a flooded street, which essentially looks like a river. So we've got the same effect of this diminishing perspective looking down the street, and it's taking your viewer from the foreground into the background and giving that connection between the two, and adding more for your viewer to look at and kind of digest within the photograph. Here, I think you should start to be getting the idea about this technique of using rivers, roads, paths, and using those shapes in order to drive your viewer's attention between the foreground and the background. And that's what I was trying to do with this particular image. And in this one, I try to capture this boy right in the center of the frame. And again, in a way, we're using a shape. We're using a strong shape. You can see that the road, as it disappears into the distance, kind of creates this triangular shape. On either side of it, the way that the lakes fall, they also create these triangular shapes. And so these all point you down through the image and give you this feeling of connection between the foreground and the background, and it leads your eye through the image from foreground to background and just creates something more interesting for your viewer to look at. And here you can see the obvious shape drawing you down with the diminishing perspective. So lots of different scenes can be used to utilize the diminishing perspective effect. This is one of my favorite photographs from my story. And you can see how I actually use the silhouettes to create a really interesting compositional effect. I've kind of offsetted them to the left. It's not quite strictly the rule of thirds, but you can see how they fall on that roughly that bottom left intersection. That's kind of where your eyes go first in this image. But then again, with the diminishing perspective of the canal behind them, it kind of draws your attention all the way into the photograph. Again, makes this really interesting composition. So it's not just the diminishing perspective, it's a little bit of the rule of thirds in there. And I'm also using silhouettes as well. Again, all these different little elements to keep your attention and keep drawing you into my photos. So the main tips for if you want to use diminishing perspectives in your images is to look for situations that can provide you with those diminishing perspective, such as roads and rivers, like in the images that I just showed you. Those are always great for using this effect, especially if you get a higher viewpoint. And often I like to use people within the foreground because that gives you a little bit of added dynamic interest and kind of sometimes helps you connect the foreground and the background that's quite clear. And you can use diminishing perspective to add depth to your images. That's one of the best ways in which you can utilize this technique. Obviously, you'll need a higher F number, so you're getting more in focus. You don't want a very shallow depth of field with the technique. You want to have a larger F number, so you're getting most of the scene in focus when you're using this effect. That's really important. But really, you've got to think about point number 3 there. Try to think how you can use the diminishing perspective to lead your viewer's attention to different things within the frame of your photograph. Because again, all of these techniques are about leading your viewer to different things, leading your viewer to what you want to look at, them to look at, trying to connect something happening within the foreground to something important in the background. Diminishing perspectives is a great way to be able to do that, as are many of the other techniques that we've covered in today's live stream. They're all tools to help you tell stories with your photographs. Okay, let's see if we've got any final comments and questions from you guys. We had a couple that came in before the chat. This was from Playing with Sid on Instagram. Thanks for following, Sid. Please talk about layers, how to push beyond the foreground, middle, and the background. Well, Sid, I'd actually encourage you to go onto my channel, onto the main page, because I've got one of my videos talks specifically about how to use layers within your photographs. Basically, layers are different planes within your photograph. So like Sid mentioned in his comment, thinking about your foreground, middle ground, and background, and how you connect them. You can do that a little bit with diminishing perspectives, as we talked about, but there's a whole world in terms of composition about how you can play with different elements within your foreground, middle ground, and background, and how those connect with each other to make interesting compositions. So I did cover that in one of my other videos, and maybe I'll cover it in another live stream in the future and kind of share more of those images that I made using that technique. But I actually think I covered it in my first live stream. That was one of the main composition techniques that I covered. So go back to that live stream, Sid, and have a look for this technique. What I normally do is I actually break my live streams up into bite-sized pieces, bite-sized videos, about 5 or 10 minutes long. So you can go back in and that specific video to learn a bit more about that technique and how I use it.